The laughter started before the door had fully opened. Terrence Hobbs heard it from the hallway, that particular kind of laughter, loose and unguarded, the kind people allow themselves when they're certain no one who matters is listening. He paused outside the boardroom on the 38th floor of the Calloway building, his mop cart catching on the threshold of the carpet runner, and he heard his own name somewhere inside that laughter, muffled but unmistakable. He didn't go in yet. He stood in the corridor for a moment, his hand resting on the cart handle, and looked out the window at the gray November sky above downtown Calgary. The mountains were hidden behind cloud today. They were there, though. They always were, whether you could see them or not. He pushed the door open. The room went about 70% quiet. Not fully. That would have required them to acknowledge they'd been caught. Instead, conversation shifted, eyes dropped to phones, and only one person in the room didn't bother pretending. That was Derek Calloway, the CEO, second-generation inheritor of his father's commercial real estate firm, who was sitting at the head of the table with his arms crossed and his expression arranged into something between amusement and impatience. "Hobbs," Derek said. "Perfect timing." Terrence nodded once. He moved to the side credenza where someone had left a ring of coffee on the mahogany, and he began to work on it with a cloth. "We were just talking about you, actually." Derek leaned back in his chair. Around the table sat 7 other people, 3 senior executives, 2 lawyers, and 2 representatives from a Swiss investment consortium who had flown in that morning and who now watched the exchange with the careful neutrality of people being paid by the hour. Their interpreter, a young woman named Claudette from a translation firm in Montreal, sat slightly apart from the group, her laptop open, her expression unreadable. "Apparently," Derek continued, loud enough for the room, "our maintenance supervisor spent 30 years in Europe. He said it the way someone might say, apparently our janitor once played in a garage band, the implication being that such a thing was charming in its smallness. Heidelberg, wasn't it, Hobbs? Someone told me you used to work over there." "I did," Terrence said. "So you'd know some German then?" Derek smiled at the table. "A little tourist German. Bitte, danke, that kind of thing." Terrence folded the cloth and set it on his cart. "Some," he said. There was a quiet ripple of amusement. One of the lawyers, a man named Jeffrey Park, smiled at his phone. Sandra Beaumont, the head of acquisitions, looked out the window. The Swiss representatives, a trim, watchful man called Walter Pruitt and his younger colleague Priya Anand, exchanged a brief glance that Terrence could not entirely read. He didn't need to read it. He'd been in rooms like this one before. Different rooms, different countries, same architecture of assumption. "The reason I asked," Derek said, sitting forward now, growing businesslike, "is that Claudette here has hit a bit of a wall." He gestured toward the interpreter, who did not look offended, only tired. "The consortium's main contract document, the one we're signing this afternoon, has some passages that aren't standard Hochdeutsch. Some older legal phrasing, apparently. Swiss German with some Austrian influence, Claudette tells us. And the AI we've been using," he waved a hand toward the laptop at the center of the table, where a translation program had a long document open and partially annotated, "keeps flagging it as uncertain." "We've been at it since 9 this morning," Sandra said, not unkindly. 3 hours, Jeffrey added, to no one in particular. Derek looked at Terrence. There was something theatrical about the look, performing for the room. "So, since we're paying Claudette's firm $600 an hour, and the AI isn't getting us there, and since our maintenance supervisor apparently lived in German-speaking Europe for 3 decades, he spread his hands. "Translate this. If you can get us through these 3 clauses by noon, I'll give you my salary for the month." The room was quiet. Not the performed quiet from before. Something more genuine. Terrence looked at him. "You don't need to do that," he said. "No, I insist." Derek was smiling. "Consider it incentive." Claudette, the interpreter, closed her laptop partway and looked at Terrence with an expression he recognized. The particular attention of someone who actually knows what they're dealing with and is waiting to see if someone else does too. Terrence looked at the document on the central laptop. He looked at the 3 flagged clauses, highlighted in yellow, with the AI's uncertain renderings in red beneath each one. Then he looked at Derek Calloway, who was still smiling. "May I sit down?" Terrence asked. He had come to Calgary 18 months ago, and he had taken the maintenance job at the Calloway building because it was available and because the hours suited him. He worked 6 to 2, which meant he was home when his daughter finished school. He drove a 2009 Civic with a dent in the rear bumper from an incident in a Sobeys parking lot that he'd never gotten around to fixing. He wore the same 3 fleece pullovers in rotation and bought his groceries at the No Frills on Center Street and had never, in 18 months, mentioned to anyone at work what he'd done before. There was no particular reason to. The work was clean and the building was calm, and the people mostly left him alone, which was what he needed. His daughter, Lily, who was 12, had started at a new school and was beginning cautiously to make friends. That was what mattered. Everything else, the title, the office on the Schillerstrasse, the years of work that had preceded both, was another country, literally and otherwise. His wife, Caroline, had died 14 months ago, 7 weeks after they'd moved back to Canada, which was where she'd wanted to be at the end. Lung cancer, non-smoker, the kind of thing that still felt, Terence, like a clerical error, something meant for someone else's file. He didn't talk about that either. He sat down at the laptop and read the 3 flagged clauses carefully. The first was straightforward enough, though the AI had stumbled on an archaic contractual formulation, nach Maßgabe des Einvernehmens, that it had rendered loosely as by mutual agreement, which was close but missing the embedded implication of proportionality. In Swiss commercial law, that phrase carried specific weight around how disputes about percentage splits would be adjudicated. It wasn't the same as a standard mutual agreement clause. The second clause was where the document got interesting. It was 4 sentences long and concerned the transfer of liability in the event of a development delay. On its surface, it appeared to assign liability equally to both parties. But buried in the second sentence was a subordinate clause, sofern die zuständige Partei nicht binnen 14 Werktagen schriftlich widerspricht, that fundamentally reversed the balance. If Calloway Properties failed to submit a written objection within 14 business days of any delay notice, full liability defaulted to them automatically. The AI had translated the sentence accurately in isolation, but had not flagged it as a liability trap because it didn't understand the structural relationship between that sentence and the others. The third clause contained a definition of wesentliche Vertragsänderung, material contract amendment, that was significantly narrower than what would be standard in Canadian commercial agreements. Under the definition as written, Calloway could make considerable changes to a development project without triggering the renegotiation rights that would normally protect them. It was not illegal. It was simply written to their disadvantage in a way that wouldn't be obvious unless you'd spent time in Swiss and Austrian commercial law environments. Terence read all 3 clauses twice. Then he looked up. The room had gone very still. Most of the people around the table had been watching him without quite admitting to it. The first clause, he said, your AI is mostly right on, but it's missing a proportionality implication that matters for dispute resolution. He explained what he meant in 3 sentences. Sandra Beaumont had stopped looking out the window. The second clause, he said, is a liability transfer trap. If you don't respond in writing to any delay notice within 14 business days, you absorb full liability automatically. That's not in the AI translation because the AI read the sentence correctly but didn't flag the structural relationship. He looked at Jeffrey Park. You'd want that sentence removed or the default reversed. Jeffrey Park was no longer looking at his phone. And the third clause, Terence said, redefines material amendment in a way that narrows your renegotiation rights considerably. It's not fraudulent, but it's written to limit your ability to revisit terms if the project scope changes. He pushed the laptop back to the center of the table. The room held its silence for 3 full seconds. Claudette, the interpreter from Montreal, looked at Terence with an expression that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. She leaned forward and looked at Clause 2 again, and then she nodded, once to herself, and said quietly, I thought that one was odd. Walter Pruitt, the senior Swiss representative, had not moved. He was watching Terence with an attention that was different in quality from everyone else's. Not surprised exactly, but recalibrating. Beside him, Priya Anand had taken out a pen. Derek Calloway was not smiling anymore. Where, he said slowly, did you learn to read Swiss commercial law? It wasn't quite a question, more an inventory being taken. Heidelberg for 9 years, Terence said, then Zurich for 11, then Vienna for 8. He looked at the table. I was a corporate attorney. Mergers and acquisitions primarily. I retired 3 years ago. The silence that followed was of a different character entirely than all the silences before it. Jeffrey Park set his phone face down on the table. Sandra Beaumont said quietly and with genuine feeling, "Oh my God." Terrence had not planned to tell anyone. He had not planned not to tell anyone either. There had simply never been a moment that seemed to call for it, and he had learned, over 30 years of sitting across tables from people, that information volunteered without purpose has a way of changing how rooms feel. He'd liked the way this building felt. He'd liked being the man who knew where the fuses were and which elevator had a tendency to hesitate between 12 and 13. He thought about Lily and the breakfast they'd had that morning. Scrambled eggs, the good kind with cheese, while she told him about a project on the St. Lawrence River she was doing with a girl named Amara who might become a real friend. It was hard to tell yet. He thought about how she'd put her cereal bowl in the dishwasher without being asked, a small thing that had caught him so off guard he'd had to look out the kitchen window for a moment. He thought about Caroline, who would have laughed about this. About the boardroom and the contract and Derek Calloway's salary, with the specific laugh she reserved for situations that were absurd and inevitable in equal measure. He stood up from the table. "I'll finish the third-floor credenzas," he said to the room. "Then the executive washrooms. If you need someone to walk your legal team through the clauses formally, I'm happy to do that after 2 o'clock. That's when I'm done." He moved toward his cart. "Mr. Hobbs," it was Walter Pruitt who spoke. His English was precise, accented, careful. "Terence Hobbs, of the Zurich practice." Terence stopped. "I thought I recognized the name from the badge," Walter Pruitt said. "We were on opposite sides of the Hardenbrook matter. 2009, you were representing the Canadian consortium." Terence turned. He looked at Walter Pruitt more carefully now. A thin man, mid-60s, silver at the temples, the particular quality of stillness that some people develop after decades of being the most competent person in a room. "I remember," Terence said. "You won." "We settled," Walter Pruitt said. "Your client got more than we expected." A pause. "It's good work you've done here today. The contract needed it," Terence said. What happened next took the better part of an hour. Jeffrey Park called the firm's senior partner, who came upstairs in 12 minutes looking slightly flustered. Derek Calloway sat at the head of the table and said very little. Sandra Beaumont, who had a quality that Terence had quietly respected since his first week in the building, a capacity for absorbing new information without defending herself against it, took out a legal pad and began organizing questions. Walter Pruitt asked Terence to walk through the liability clause one more time, which Terence did, pointing to the specific subordinate structure and explaining the legal precedent in Swiss cantonal courts that gave it teeth. Claudette sat beside him and followed the German closely, nodding at intervals. Priya Anand rewrote the second clause in longhand and then typed it. Walter Pruitt reviewed it and said 3 words to her in German that Terence understood to mean, "Yes, that's correct." The third clause was struck and replaced with a standard Canadian definition with a mutual agreement addendum. By 12:30, the document had been revised, reviewed by both legal teams, and was ready for signature. Derek Calloway, for his part, had the look of a man reassessing a number of things simultaneously. He had said very little for the last 40 minutes. When Terence gathered his cloth from the credenza and moved toward the door with his cart, Derek said his name. "Hobbs." Terence stopped. "I said I'd give you my salary." Derek's voice had lost its theater. He sounded tired, genuine maybe, in a way he hadn't been before. "You don't need to," Terence said. "I didn't do it for that. I know you didn't." Derek looked at the table, then at Terence. "Is there something you want? From the firm, actually want?" Terence considered this. "Not for long. The freight elevator on 4 has been misaligned for 3 weeks," he said. "I've put in 2 maintenance requests. If someone could approve the repair order, that would be good. My cart's getting stuck." Derek Calloway stared at him. "I'll have facilities call you this afternoon," Sandra Beaumont said, and she wrote it down. He finished the 3rd floor at 1:15. The executive washrooms were done by 1:30, and he returned his cart to the maintenance room on the lower level, where he signed out, changed his shoes, and put on his coat. The November cold met him at the loading bay door like a reminder. He turned up his collar and walked to the Civic. On the drive home, he stopped at the No Frills and bought pasta, the good tomatoes in the can, a block of aged cheddar, and a small bunch of flowers, the kind they sold near the checkout in plastic sleeves, yellow and orange, nothing special. Caroline had always bought those flowers, not for occasions, just because they were there and cheerful. He put them on the kitchen table before Lily got home. She came in at 3:15 with a backpack that was slightly too large for her and a look of mild indignation that meant something had happened at school that she was still deciding whether to be upset about. She dropped the backpack by the door, pulled off her boots, looked at the flowers, and then looked at him. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," he said. He was already at the stove. She climbed onto a kitchen stool and pulled out her homework. "How was work?" Terrence considered the question. He thought about the boardroom on the 38th floor, and the 3 yellow highlighted clauses, and the silence that had followed the word attorney, and Walter Pruitt saying it's good work in the careful way of a man who does not distribute compliments carelessly. "Fine," he said. "Quiet day." He stirred the tomatoes and listened to her tell him about the St. Lawrence River project and about Amara, who had apparently said something funny at lunch that Lily was now reconstructing from memory with great attention to detail, the way she did when something mattered to her, but she didn't want to say so directly. Outside, the cloud had broken while he wasn't looking. The mountains were back, faint and blue, and very far away, and entirely unhurried the way they always were. They'd been there the whole time. Terrence turned down the heat under the pot and listened to his daughter talk, and the evening settled around them like something ordinary, which was exactly what it was, and exactly what he'd worked to build, and enough.